Greetings and welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. As an extension of my Instagram page, Cerebral Women, this podcast offers insights into the visual art world. I interview artists, mainly artists of color and female artists, who will freely articulate what inspires their creativity. In addition, you'll hear interesting perspectives from dedicated art professionals who work with artists and the art institutions that feature them. I'm confident that collectively, these individuals will indeed stimulate your mind as they do our eyes. Please know these interviews are conducted in my Manhattan apartment, so please forgive the background sounds of city life. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. In this episode, I feature Miles Greenberg. Born in Montreal, he is a New York-based performance artist and sculptor. His work consists of large-scale, sensorially immersive and often site-specific environments revolving around the physical body and space. These installations are activated with often extreme durational performances that invoke the body of sculptural material. These performances are then captured in real time before the audience to generate later video works and sculptures. At age 17, Miles left formal education, launching himself into 4 years of independent research on movement and architecture, which spanned a number of residencies in Paris, Northern Italy, Beijing, and New York. Miles has worked under the mentorship of Édouard Lock, Wilson and Marina Abramović, and has since exhibited extensively internationally. He has been featured in Document Journal, Cultured Magazine, The New York Times, Art in America, and Hype Beast, to name only a few. In the fall of 2020, Miles staged an elaborate live installation titled Late October, which involved 7 performers, including himself, blinded by white contact lenses, nude and lacquered, revolved slowly above an ice blue basin for 7 consecutive hours. Please visit Miles' website for more details about this body of work. Enjoy this episode featuring Miles Greenberg. Miles, thank you for joining me on my podcast. I'm delighted to feature you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So when did you discover your artistic passion?
The arts have always been totally ubiquitous in my life, and I really owe that to my mother. She exposed me very, very young to all forms of art. I remember as a child, my earliest memories were being on a tour bus with her theater troupe. She was an actress at the time doing this sort of absurdist Russian theater. And so I was traveling around with them in Edinburgh and around France and just Europe, handing out flyers on the street. So yeah, by the time I was, I think around 6 or so, we moved back to Canada and I started school. She essentially made sure that I never missed a Venice Biennial in my lifetime, which is quite a privilege and an education unto itself.
So regarding your education, when did you decide to leave formal education?
I was, I believe, 16 or 17. I started what's called Cégep, which is sort of the equivalent of grade 12 for Quebec. And after 4 weeks of that, I decided to leave. It didn't really feel like the right place or the right pace for me. And I was also already kind of dipping my toes into like university level education with like AP programs and like from grade 9 on. So it was a pretty quick decision. I'm grateful to have been sort of supported through it. And I always told myself, you know, I would make it to 21, just sort of doing my thing. And then at that point, I would go back to school if and when it made sense. And I have to say, it hasn't quite made sense yet.
How would you define your practice?
I do performance, I do videos, and I do sculptures. I make durational sort of performance installations that last between, on average, 7 to 12 or 24 hours, you know, or multiple days, non-consecutively, in order to solicit a physiological kind of response in the audience that heightens their sort of sensitivities to themselves and the world, essentially. I try to kind of stretch out an emotional or physical response in the body, like something like a panic attack or an orgasm or a state of ecstasy into that something that doesn't typically last or sustain very long in the human body for various reasons, into a macro scale, into like 7 hours. What happens after 7 hours of pain? What happens after 7 hours of ecstasy? Nobody really knows. So my work really centers around digging into those physiological experiences and interpreting them in a way that allows the audience to also sort of interpret their own bodies differently. It's a lot about sort of a really extreme kind of sensualism. And then I translate that into like immersive kind of videos and sculptures and installations that play with architecture in a way that makes the viewer's body change.
Your performances, they're so long. And I mean, to stand there for hours, I mean, I understand how you can shut your body down, but you can't shut your mind down. I mean, you have to keep thinking for that duration. I mean, that must be so challenging.
Oh, I actually disagree. You can't shut your body down. That's the other thing, is that your body is also constantly, even if you're just standing or even just sitting. I mean, sitting is the worst. It takes so many muscles to sit. It takes so many muscles to stand and maintain our balance and maintain our sort of structural integrity. So you don't just slump over and crush your organs, or poke yourself with your own ribs. It's even in stillness, there's so many technicalities, and there are just as many technicalities in sort of not doing anything with your mind either. So it's never really about shutting down. It's sort of about going deeper and deeper and deeper into the now, as much and as often as you can. Of course, it's easy to sort of waver in and out and natural, but I want to sort of register those kind of natural ins and outs of consciousness and presence, and make legible all the particularities of using a human being as a sculptural material, in essence. I don't want to pretend like the body is perfect. I'm always very curious about the shape that I'll be in by the end of 24 hours, by the end of 8 days, by the end of whatever. It's going to change shapes. Marble and stone change shapes over the course of 600 years. The human body changes shapes over the course of a couple of hours. And I think that's natural and should be welcomed. Yeah, I think, duration started in my practice as sort of a question of accessibility. I wanted people, unlike in traditional theater, to be able to see my work, at 9 a.m. or at 5 p.m. or sort of whenever they wanted and for however long they wanted. I'm not big on like prescribed times and points of view. So it was always sort of counterintuitive to me to dictate that to my audience. I wanted to allow for as much agency as possible. So it really started like that. It really started like thinking of how I like to see art, which is walking through the marble halls at the Louvre or at the Met or whatever, being able to sort of grab a piece of pizza, look at something casually for 10 minutes, come back, talk to a friend, take a photo with my phone, sort of do whatever, or sit there and meditate. Absolutely. But to sort of obligate the audience to do it in a certain kind of way is I think, frankly, very Eurocentric, just against my nature kind of way of thinking. So I was always sort of drawn to it as a means of allowing people to consume the work in their own way and as they need to fulfill their needs. If I'm aligning myself with this idea of therapy, of this idea of sort of catharsis or like emotional sensibilizing, I think what's really key to that is allowing people to be themselves as well. And then over time, I began to say, well, what's really also interesting about it for me is that I'm going through all these transformations as well. Over 7 hours, of course, you're going to be a different person after a really intense physical experience of that amount of time. And I think that the audience feels that too. And there's this sort of communion that happens where the audience feels free, but they're present and they're sort of there with you. And when you ask me about how I perceive or whether I feel the audience or what have you, yeah, like I don't see them and they know that I can't see them, but it sort of puts us, I think, together in this very different way that I think is where a lot of the poetry lies, but not where I expected it to lie. Just one last thing that I'd like to articulate. I think it's really important to note that my work is not about pain, and it's never been about pain. I think people look at performance artists who do really extreme gestures and they think of, Marina has to grapple with this all the time, the idea that we're masochists or that we're here to push ourselves to extremes. I mean, some people are, but, at least in my work, I think that's a very easy and kind of lazy reading of it. It's much more about using those sort of extreme sensations, whether it is pain or, bliss or anything, or heartbreak or what have you, just as a point of departure and as a doorway. And ultimately it's kind of incidental. I think it's more important to me to think about sort of the result over time of staying with whatever it is that we are in that space staying with, and just seeing what happens, but it's not about inflicting like anything. And that also kind of speaks, I think, to a question of like accountability and like, what is the audience's role of being accountable or witnessing something? It sort of relegates like the whole gesture into like this space of like horror or incident, like watching somebody suffer. And what is your sort of role in that? It's not about that. And I think that the people who get it and the people who are there hopefully feel that. It's my job to facilitate an environment where they do feel that. They feel like it's not just a question of gratuitous violence. I feel very strongly like in my work, I don't want to create more violence than is already in the world. And I think that I come from a generation as well that is very sensitive to and capable of talking about violence and addressing it without perpetuating it or reproducing it, which is different from the audience, from the generation before me or various generations before me. Like Hermann Nietzsche is an example of somebody I'm very inspired by and was inspired by for my last performance, but, the Viennese Actionists, but the ways in which they, I think, wanted to talk about the violence that they were experiencing, during World War II in Austria was a very different language and a very different sensibility than what a 22-year-old, or a 24-year-old Black queer person is going to produce, because we just have different tools at our disposal. We have different vernacular at our disposal. My work is not about pain or violence.
What materials do you use in your sculptures?
My sculptures are made of high density urethane, which is an inert material that is actually the same material that you would use to make a positive for a mold for a bronze. So there's sort of like, you could say maybe blueprints or prototypes for eventual bronzes. And I make them by creating these 3D meshes out of 3D scans of my performances that I make with a modified 3D scanner, which I've essentially like in a way dumbed down by like hacking into the sort of the software of it. It's kind of a method that I use to, create these very automatic glitches in the sort of the reading of the body by not allowing it to correct itself. Like typically a 3D scanner will have a lot of autocorrective capacity. It understands when it's seeing repetition. It understands where it is in space, so it doesn't sort of copy, an arm or a leg or what have you. I've turned all of these faculties off, so it sort of looks like these weird, eroded figures in motion. Because I really wanted to find a way to kind of translate the performance practice, this sort of durational practice, right, into something static or something that can last. And I guess my all-time dream would be to make bronzes. So I'm kind of trying to get there.
How demanding, both mentally and physically, is your work?
Very. I mean, that's the short answer. It depends always on the piece, sort of in terms of what we're considering that, But I make work basically out of an investigation of, extreme sensations in the body. I'm thinking of not necessarily pain, but like if you think of an emotional sort of reflex or an outburst or just a feeling that you have that typically the body doesn't sustain for more than 10 or 15 minute fight or flight, things like that. Like we have our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous systems that play with each other and bring us up and bring us back down when we sort of, as is useful to us, right? Evolutionarily, it's about energy expenditure or whatever. I really want to almost take a state like that and see what happens when we stretch it out over, instead of 10, 15, 30 minutes, 7 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, and sort of see where we go with it. I think it's not something that we're used to in our sort of day-to-day life. examining the physiological limitations of our bodies, but they're there, and they're sort of, I think they're fascinating, and looking at the body as kind of this thing that we do have agency over. Yeah, I just want to sort of push it as far as it can go and see what we get. I don't know, oftentimes until I've made the work. But it is about kind of finding out what's at the, what's behind the kind of the door of limitation.
Are you able to connect with the audience at all? I mean, do you concentrate, focus, or even think of the audience while you're working?
First and foremost, I can't see them. I tend to wear, I would say always actually, contact lenses that obscure my vision. And that's for two reasons. One is that I find it protects the public. It sort of turns the whole body, when you erase the eyes, into a form, right? Like it kind of takes away our personhood when we can't really see the pupil or the iris. We say that whatever, the eyes are the windows to the soul. That's very true. Like we really, I think, feel the difference when somebody doesn't have a visible eye. It kind of, that's why sunglasses are kind of used to obscure one's identity. It's this very ancient, I think, reflex that we have, how we understand a human being. So, when I erase the eye, or sort of homogenize it or abstract it in any way, people can read my body more as my body, or the bodies of my performers, as more as sculptural material than who they are. So that's one perspective. The other is that, internally, it kind of allows you to go inside a lot more sort of easily. The particular white contact lenses that I use, I have varying opacities of them, but the most opaque ones, I won't see anything except for what's very, very directly lit, very close to me. So, the audience are sort of these blobs, these gray shapes that kind of move around in front of me. But, and I think I feel them, but I don't connect with them in the conventional sense at all, no.
How did COVID affect you?
I think with work like I do, it would be easy to think, right, that my whole world might stop, because performance art, we think of it as something that relies on an audience, and in a way it does. But I wanted to find as many ways as possible to reinterpret it as a medium into ways that I had access to, I guess, at the time.
So how did it affect your sleep patterns?
Yeah. Every day I was going to bed at around 5 o'clock in the morning and waking up at around noon, which, as it turns out, is what comes naturally to me. I didn't really realize that before COVID. I knew that I like to stay up, but my creative sweet spot starts at around 1:30 a.m., like no matter where I am in the world. So to sort of already have the ability to kind of milk that a little bit. I mean, I went and I was living at my mom's in Montreal for the first 5 months. And during that time, I didn't have anything on me. I didn't bring much more than 3 days worth of clothes. So I bought a pack of printer paper, and I just sort of started to draw out new ideas. And I created essentially a body of work, several bodies of work that I'm still working through to this day. I just sort of would sit down 3-4 in the morning and just come up with things in total silence and like vacancy. My mom would get better and I was really alone, which was really beautiful. Despite what was going on in the world, it allowed me that space.
Have you ever thought about, if you weren't an artist, what other career path you would have chosen?
Probably something in the sciences. I'm really obsessed with human anatomy. I love biology. Biology is probably my favorite thing, even within my art practice. It's plays a huge role. I've always been kind of a nerd about the body and how it works. And I somehow, it's just one of those things, we all have that kind of, that special interest, that obsession, where you can learn about something in passing a decade ago and like retain it forever. Like that's me in like high school biology. I could easily ace a high school biology exam, like to this day. Yeah, I mean, it plays so deeply into my work and how I think about sort of and compose with like the body, is I'm thinking a lot about its internal functions just as much as its sort of external form. So when I'm kind of structuring a performance and how I want people to stand and how I want my sort of performers and myself to be functioning, I'm thinking also about the sort of the viscera and the internal organs and sort of the positioning of, sort of the basin and the bones. And that's all very much sort of part of the poetry of it. It's very inside out.
Do you listen to music at all while you're thinking through what you're going to do next?
I do. So during COVID, I was like obsessively listening to Chopin. I would just put on the nocturnes over and over and over on repeat. And it was just sort of almost like this Pavlovian like trigger that would just kind of put my brain into the right place. Ravel as well, the Ravel Miroir. Yeah, so I guess a lot of classical for when I'm working. I listen to a lot of Ryuichi Sakamoto, and then just like weirder stuff like Alvin Noto. And then I work quite closely with, I've worked with a few composers with my own work, my friend Julian, Personal Jesus, for one. Yeah, music is really important to what I do. I've also, composed some of my own soundtracks as well.
I know that technology also has an impact on your work, right?
Yeah, it does. So sort of as I was describing earlier, right, with the sculptures, that's kind of a new element in my work. But yeah, I guess when it comes to technology and art, my golden rule is I think that an artwork should always absolutely require the medium and the means by which it is made. I think if people are using technology superfluously in their work, it reads really poorly. If somebody's making a 3D video or a 360 video or like a VR work that very much should have been just a standard video work or multi-channel video work, I don't really believe in that. So, when it comes to questions about like new technologies and my work and sort of people approaching me about doing AR, VR or like, I think the answer is absolutely, but when I have an idea that needs it. I'm not just going to transform a performance into something it doesn't need to be, or I'm not going to transform a sculpture into something that it shouldn't be, But yeah, I think it's been really exciting to get better acquainted with like 3D modeling as a way of interpreting the body and a way of creating new forms. Because I never went to school in a formal sense, I feel like I'm still very much in the midst of my education. And I think that's really important to me to uphold. I think it should be important for all artists to uphold, a sense of just being a student. I kind of intend to hopefully be that way until my old age. Yeah, it's just continued curiosity and being porous. I don't know. I think, yeah, also I just feel constantly naive about certain things, or maybe not naive that's maybe not the word, but rather that my interpretation of things is more intuitive than academic. So I'm always really, really, really happy to get more information about something, especially as it relates to kind of my practice or things that have nothing to do with my practice, but that I take inspiration from, like biology or space or, whatever. I don't really understand how one would like sort of turn off that muscle to be porous, at least it hasn't happened yet, thankfully.
When do the titles of your work enter the creative process?
I have struggled a lot with titles in my life. You can ask anybody I've ever worked with, and I will not give them a title until literally they, come actually knocking on my door, asking me, saying like, we need to print the nameplates. Like, I kind of started with this whole idea of sort of creating my own medical jargon, like chemotherapy and pneumotherapy were sort of, and then the subsequent pieces which haven't, been made yet, but like myotherapy would be the next one. And then laryngotherapy are all just sort of using and appropriating words from medical jargon as interpreting a scene or a purpose. Pneumotherapy was like this sort of ritual around exercising like grief from the lungs. And I was really fascinated with like how in like various beliefs and sort of intuitive or shamanistic, like sort of spiritual medical crossovers from various cultures, they would interpret certain emotions or intuitions in similar parts of the body. Like grief is in the lungs in at least like 4 or 5 cultures, which I find really fascinating. So I was like, well, how can one exercise grief? And so I created this whole scenario that was really built around grief and the lungs. It was full of flowers and flowers with fragrance. So like hyacinths and lilies, amaranth and poppies and magnolias as well. And I wanted people to kind of walk in and have this extremely sensorial experience and kind of feel like after 7 hours, whatever was living in my lungs might be, out in the world in some way. And wanted to also extend that invitation to the audience to kind of meditate on their lungs. So it was I think the titles speak to like almost like a desire to create something very technical and procedural, but that's actually totally just like imaginary and surreal, but can actually maybe have an impact. I also like my titular sensei, if you will, like the person whose titles I admire the most are Lynette Yodomboake, who's just an incredible painter. And she has these unbelievable titles that are like lines of poetry unto themselves. I think going forward, I might try to do that as well. I've done it with a couple of them, Water in a Heat Wave or Admiration is the Furthest Thing from Understanding were 2 pieces that I did in 2021. And then the sculptures are all named after figures from various mythologies. And I like to name them like spaceships. So, because that's sort of how they feel, very experimental, like probes, So the sculptures in my last sculpture show, first and last, recently, were Narcissus 1, Icarus 1, and Orpheus 1. And now in the new museum in November, I'll be presenting 2 sculptures.
What are you excited about right now?
I mean, I'm very excited about the show I'm about to do in Amsterdam with the Marina Abramović Institute and the Carré Theater. That is going to be running from October 24th through 30th. And basically it's a whole cohort of performance artists from various disciplines doing performance at the Carré Theater to sort of break the boundaries of theater. And it's a show that Marina participating in called No Intermission. So we each sort of have our own durational pieces that'll be lasting through the entire week. So that'll be a fun challenge. And I've also never shown in Amsterdam before. And then I'm having very shortly thereafter my first American museum exhibition called Shadow of Spring at the New Museum. Myself and one other artist, Vivian Kakuri from Brazil, is this fabulous sound textile artist, and also makes these incredible sort of sculptural speaker systems, will be taking over the lobby gallery during, the next cycle of exhibitions. So the curator is Bernardo Mosquera, also from Brazil. And we're doing this whole sort of show around the principles of vibration and their effects on the body. And I'm presenting 2 like massive sculptures that'll be actually functioning fountains as well. So I'm really stoked.
I've really enjoyed this interview and I've learned quite a bit. So this is going to be my last question. What do you feel is the purpose of art? And as an artist, what is your role?
As huge as that question is, I think the first thing that comes to mind is, Toni Morrison saying, if you're free, you need to free somebody else. And if you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. I think that, especially in kind of the format that I follow, the way that bodies and people react to stimuli, I think it's an artist's job to create conditions under which we can better understand ourselves in the world, very broadly. I try to put my human experience and human experiences into sort of like a petri dish. I feel very scientific about the way that I approach the art making process. And I think that's something that I stay true to because it's the way that I can most effectively access people's minds, bodies, and spirits, thinking of it as a very sort of rigorous and direct practice. I think it's an artist's job to make space for people to dream and to feel what's in them. I think it's a question of heightening people's sensitivities to the world and to what's not only important to the artist, but what's important to them. I think that's what I'm trying to do. I think if there's a way for us to connect on the levels of our priorities and what we, and our sensations and our sensuality, I think there's a lot that can be done.
Well, thank you for what you do, because it's very challenging. And I appreciate the opportunity to feature you. You're the first artist I've featured whose practice involves so much of your body and your mind, your intellect. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.